Today's text is from Daniel, chapter 3. And Daniel is an interesting book. It's an interesting book for the many stories it has, but especially in today's text, we read about the putting of these three brothers into the furnace. And I know we've heard this story maybe a million times. If you've been in the church for any amount of time, I'm sure you've heard this story. It is when the king Nebuchadnezzar decides that he is God. He is a God, and creates a golden image that all must bow down before. That when the sound of the lute or the trumpet or the music plays, all must bow down and worship the image that is created. And for many, they bow down because this is what the law states. For some, worship and do as they are required, not really understanding what it is that they are doing or why it is they are doing it. For many, they just bowed down when they heard the harp and the pipe and the lyre. When they heard it all, they bowed down before this golden image. But there were these three brothers, three believers, three followers of God, whose names may sound strange, but yet we've all heard them again and again. They are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three refused to bow, even though it was by order of the king that it was required that they bow down. They refused. And as the story goes, there were those who saw and were jealous because these were three important figures. And they knew that they weren't bowing, so they came to the king and said, "Hey, king, you know those three guys? Those who are doing this work that you wanted? Well, they're not bowing down when they're supposed to." We've all had people like that in our lives that'll bring, they're just saying. They're not bringing gossip. They're not bringing other things. They're not trying to bring trouble, but I did see that this person was not doing what they're supposed to. And so they're brought before the king. And our text today is where that story comes. As they were brought to the king, they were accused and said, they have not bowed. And in verse 19 it says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was so filled with rage," because they denied, or they said that they did not bow down. They didn't deny it. He was so filled with rage that his face was distorted. He ordered that the furnace be heated up 7 times than was customary. For the punishment of not bowing down before this image was to be burned in the oven of fire. And because they disobeyed and they didn't bow down and recognize that King Nebuchadnezzar truly was a god, therefore they must suffer. So he wanted them to be burned completely and utterly. Heat up the oven 7 times hotter than it normally is. So the men were bound, still wearing their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments. And they were thrown into the blazing fire. Because the king's command was urgent and the furnace was so overheated, the raging flames killed the men who lifted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It was so hot that the men who were ordered to take them and push them into this oven were burned and died. But something happened. As this heated oven was burning everything that came near, the 3 men that were thrown in, not a hair on their head was burned. And when the king looked in, he says, "Was it not 3 men that we threw into the fire?" They answered the king, "Yes, that is true." He replied, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the middle of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the 4th has the appearance of a god." 3 went in, and 4 are seen. 3 betrayed the king because they refused to bow down before him, to bow down to him as a god, not to bow down as a king. I think there's a difference there. If being king and he deserves a bow because of being king is one thing, but he wanted to be a god. Therefore, they could not bend and bow to him. But yet 3 were thrown into the fire and 4 are seen. As I was talking earlier, the lessons that are burned into us are those that are always the toughest. Here, the king who had brought Israel into exile was now seeing the power of Israel's God. The king who was trying to be a god himself realizes that he is just a man compared to the God of Israel. And as I was thinking about how do I bring this into today's context, bringing this story that we love and we've heard spoken of in so many different ways, how do we make it unique to speak to our hearts today? I thought about what are some of the things that we bow down to? Who are some of the people that we bow down to? Do we bow down to the almighty dollar, making it our God with a little g? Do we bow down to our business because we have to work hard and pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make it our God with a little g? Do we bow down to others who we feel are more important than we are? Do we bow down to superiors at work because they claim their authority over us? Who do you bow down to in the midst of life? We've all had at one point or another to think about how and who we bow down to. And I know it's not a literal bowing down to. We may not have a big golden image in front of us that every time the music plays we have to bow before and worship. But we have all bowed down to something at one point in our lives. Sometimes it's when we decide not to bow anymore that the trouble comes. Whether it's to our families, when it's time to break some of those holds that are on us. Whether it's those cycles in our lives that we continue to do when we decide to stand up and to break the cycle. That's when we stand up and not bow down to that God with a little g. For we are all around us are cycles in our lives. Whether it be that we are easily given for something or easily strayed into other things because of where we've been and what we've been through. It's not until the day that we decide not to bow. It's not until the day that we decide it's time to stop this that others recognize and see. Then the cycles can be broken. For the story goes that the king recognized that he was trying to be a god, but indeed he was not. He says, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God." They were willing to break the cycle. Are you willing to do that in your life? Are you willing to not bow down as you always have? Are you willing to stop bowing? Are you willing to break the cycle that continues to keep you where you are? Whether it's a family cycle, whether it's a cycle that's within the workplace, whether it's a cycle that's within you. For too often we keep making the same mistakes again and again because we can't break that cycle ourselves. Are you willing to stand up and not bow down before it? In our story today, they were willing to stand. In our stories of history, we see that people were willing to take a stand and they changed the world. The simple act of staying seated at the front of a bus started a civil rights movement that changed the U.S. Today, even as we look forward to the Super Bowl, we see that there was one who was willing to kneel during the national anthem in order to bring to light injustice. And yet, he continues to stand against all of this, even in the midst of so much trouble. It was his willingness to kneel down that he was willing to stand against. Are you willing to take a stand? Whether that means that you sit for justice, or it means that you kneel down knowing that it will bring the end of your career, but bring light justice. Are you willing to take a stand against the norm in order to break what is the norm? We were talking in Sunday school earlier that norms from 100 years ago are very different than norms from today. We see that in Virginia, the governor was painted in blackface and taken pictures of for the yearbook, when in the early 20th century, that was the norm. It was never okay, but it was the norm. It wasn't until people who knew that it was wrong were willing to stand against it that it became something that shouldn't be done. Are you willing to stand against norms that are wrong? There are those who think that because something is the law, therefore it is right. But how do you stand up for those who are in need if the law is continuously keeping them in need? Civil disobedience is not about keeping to the law because it's the law. It's about taking those laws that are wrong and standing against them. These three gentlemen knew that the law was wrong to bow down before a golden image, and they took a stand against it. We see today, as those who are struggling continue to struggle because of things that are outside of their control, are we willing to stand up for them? Are we willing to stand up with them? Are we willing to just break the cycle? It's easy to just let things go as they are. It's easy to complain just to complain. It's easy to say from a distance, hey, that's wrong over there. We're good at that. But when we're asked to bow down before the golden image, are you going to bow or are you going to stand? When the time comes and you have to stand with someone who is in the right, yet may be in the wrong according to law, where do you stand? Do you bow down or do you stand against? These aren't questions that are easily answered. They may be easy now because we're not going through it at the moment. Many say, oh yeah, I'm willing to give up my life for the faith because I have great faith. Because it's easy when it's not happening to us. But if we're put into a situation where our faith is brought to the forefront and we have to make the choice whether to live or to die for that faith, would we make the same decision? Would we stand up or would we bow down to the golden image? So as we move into this week, I want you to think about your life, to consider all that you have gone through, all that you are going through, all that you know is yet to come. And regardless of if you've bowed down before, I want you to take it at this moment, to look at your life at this moment and moving forward and ask yourself, am I going to continue to bow down or am I willing to stand up? The golden image is always before us, whatever it may be. It is up to us to decide whether we stand against it or we bow down once again and let things lay as they are. it is through this difficulty, through this difficult process, through this thinking, and through this meditation that we come to true faith. So I invite you and challenge you to walk with me, to stand before the golden idols in our lives, whether it be people, whether it be work, whether it be business, whatever that golden idol may be. Consider and think about your willingness. Are you willing to continue to bow down? Or are you willing to take a step and stand against the golden image? Now let us sing our hymn of response, number 46. God leads us along, number 46. Please rise if you